The beginning of addiction is never in the bottle, nor in the substance, nor even in the first act of excess. It begins in the quiet corridors of childhood, where the psyche learns its first spell of survival. You see, a child does not merely experience pain, he absorbs it as truth. When love is absent, the child does not conclude that the parent is incapable of love. The child concludes, I am unworthy of it. This is the first lie that roots itself in the soul, and from this single seed grows a forest of longing, shame, and hunger that we later call addiction. Every compulsion is a continuation of that early misinterpretation, a cry to rewrite the first story the soul ever told itself. When the infant cries and no one comes, the cry turns inward. The psyche, unable to change the outer world, changes its inner one. It splits like a mirror, shattering under too much pressure. One part continues to live on the surface, learning to smile, to perform, to adapt. The other retreats into the depths, holding the unbearable truth that life is not safe. In my work, I have called this division the beginning of the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is the hidden life of the psyche, the orphan child within, the forgotten God exiled from the conscious world. And when that shadow is not integrated, when the adult refuses to feel what the child once felt, it begins to act out its pain in symbols. Addiction is one of those symbols, a living metaphor of the lost self trying to return. I once said that the psyche has a natural drive toward wholeness, an instinct as real as hunger or sex. But when that instinct is blocked by trauma, the energy of life itself becomes contaminated with desperation. The libido, unable to flow toward creation, turns toward anesthesia. It seeks the shortest route back to unity, even if it must pass through destruction. That is why addiction feels both alive and deadly at once. It is the soul's rebellion against numbness, its attempt to awaken through intoxication. The addict drinks not to die, but to remember what it once meant to feel. Trauma, in its most subtle form, is not violence, it is disconnection. It is the moment the soul calls out and receives no echo. The child learns to silence its own music. Over years, this silence crystallizes into character traits: perfectionism, control, apathy, charm, intellect, all masks designed to hide the ancient wound of invisibility. But beneath these masks, the lost fragments of the psyche remain alive, whispering through symptoms, through dreams, through the trembling hands of the addict. What we call relapse is often the unconscious trying to remind the conscious mind, you have forgotten me again. Every addiction hides a myth. The alcoholic drinks to restore the warmth of the lost mother. The gambler plays with fate because he never felt the presence of a reliable father. The lover who cannot stop searching for new bodies is looking for the original embrace that never came. Each compulsion carries a secret theology, an attempt to recreate the lost paradise of belonging. Addiction is not about pleasure, it is about worship. The addict bows before the altar of absence, hoping that repetition will summon the God who left too soon. Let me tell you this: the unconscious is not a place of darkness. It is a place of memory. It holds not only what was forgotten, but what was too sacred to be lived consciously at the time. The trauma of childhood is often the exile of the sacred, a child's pure sensitivity, his natural capacity for wonder, empathy. Imagination is often too much for a world built on control, so he hides it, buries it, and calls that burial safety. But the sacred cannot remain buried forever. It will rise, often in distorted forms. Addiction is one of the disguises of the sacred, a misdirected yearning for transcendence. The drug becomes a false sacrament, the ritual through which the soul tries to taste infinity again. I have often met people who despised themselves for their addiction, who called it weakness, moral failure, or sin. But I tell you, it is not sin that brings a man to his knees. It is longing. Addiction is longing that has lost its compass. It is the ancient call of the soul that once knew unity and now aches for it again. But instead of seeking inward, the psyche projects its hunger outward onto substances. People, work, religion, even God conceived as an external object, and thus begins the endless chase, the spiral of hope and despair. The more one seeks outside, the farther one moves from the inner source. The psyche, like the universe, moves by archetypal law. What is split must seek reunion. What is forgotten must be remembered. When childhood trauma severs part of the self, the rest of life becomes an unconscious pilgrimage toward that lost part. Every love, every addiction, every dream, every failure is a signpost pointing back to the original separation. The addict is not a sinner, but a seeker. He has simply mistaken the direction of the sacred. There is a peculiar truth. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is connection. The antidote to fragmentation is not restraint, but integration. You cannot heal the wound by cutting off the part that hurts. You must enter it, feel it, and redeem it through consciousness. When I say consciousness, I do not mean intellect. The intellect observes but does not heal. Healing requires participation of the whole being, the mind that understands, the heart that feels, and the body that remembers. Only when all three speak the same truth does the soul begin to mend. I have seen in my patients that recovery begins the moment the addict realizes he was never addicted to the substance, but to the feeling it promised. What he sought was not alcohol, but warmth, not the high, but the loss of separation, not sex, but the sacred intimacy of being seen. The substance is the symbol, the meaning is what must be reclaimed. When the symbol is mistaken for the sacred itself, it becomes idolatry, and idolatry always ends in despair. The modern world treats addiction as a malfunction, a neurochemical misfire, a statistical probability, but numbers cannot measure the weight of loneliness, science dissects the symptom but cannot touch the soul. Addiction is a spiritual event. It is the language of a psyche trying to speak in a world that no longer listens to symbols. You cannot cure addiction with punishment or willpower, because you cannot command the unconscious by decree. You must invite it. You must listen. The soul is not conquered. It is courted. Imagine a dream. A man stands before a well. At the bottom, a faint light glows. He lowers a bucket, but when he pulls it up, it is full of sand. He tries again and again, faster each time. Desperate, sweating, the bucket breaks and the light below flickers. Finally, in exhaustion, he sits by the well and begins to weep. Only then does the water rise to meet him. This is the dream of every addict. The harder one tries to grasp the light through control. The farther it recedes. But in surrender, in honest sorrow, the water of life begins to move upward again. We must redefine what it means to heal. Healing is not the return to who you were before the wound. It is the revelation of who you are because of it. The trauma-carved space within you. And that space, painful as it is, becomes the chamber where compassion is born. Addiction is not the enemy of the soul. It is the soul's way of forcing you to pay attention. Through it, life says, you cannot live divided any longer. And so, the fall becomes initiation. The breakdown becomes the doorway to individuation. The process is not gentle. To meet your shadow is to meet the parts of you that once believed they had to die for you to survive. The inner child who was told to be silent, to be strong, to be pleasing, he must be found again. Not as a memory, but as a living presence. You must go back and sit beside that child in the darkness and say, I see you. I am here now. This is the beginning of inner alchemy. The tears shed in that moment are not weakness. They are baptism, the water that dissolves the salt of the old wound. You see, the psyche is merciful in its cruelty. It repeats what we refuse to feel until we finally listen. Addiction is a repetition of the unintegrated. The moment we dare to feel what we once fled, the need for escape begins to fade. What you integrate no longer controls you. The energy that once fueled compulsion becomes creativity, empathy, presence. The same fire that burned you becomes the fire that illuminates you. So, if you find yourself trapped in the cycle of addiction, do not ask, how do I stop? Ask, what am I not yet willing to feel? For within that question lies the key to transformation. The soul does not want perfection. It wants wholeness, and wholeness requires the embrace of every fragment, even those that shame you, frighten you, disgust you, especially those when the soul has been wounded in childhood. It does not grow crooked, it grows underground. You see, the psyche is like a tree. When its branches are cut or starved of light, the roots expand downward, seeking nourishment in the darkness. What we later call addiction is the fruit of those hidden roots. The addict suffering, then, is not proof of moral weakness, but evidence of spiritual depth. Only a soul that has tasted heaven can hunger so violently when it is gone. Addiction is the echo of paradise, remembered by a broken heart. The shadow that forms in early trauma is not a monster. It is a child holding too much truth. That child carries all the unlived emotions, the forbidden needs, the dreams that were laughed at or punished. Over time, the adult learns to banish that inner child, to build a personality strong enough to function. Society rewards that strength, yet secretly the psyche begins to starve. The shadow becomes the carrier of vitality, of imagination, of unexpressed love. It is ironic. The very qualities that could make a person whole are the ones buried in shame, and when they are not expressed consciously, they erupt through addiction. For the soul cannot live without its own energy. Consider this. Every time the addict reaches for the substance, he is reaching for the shadow's energy. He is trying to feel alive again, to bridge the chasm between who he is and who he was meant to be. The act is not purely self-destructive. It is a distorted act of remembrance. He wants to feel what he once felt before the betrayal, before the silence, before the mask. The high is a counterfeit wholeness, a temporary collapse of the ego's prison walls, and yet, in that fleeting moment, he glimpses something real, the sacred unity that all mystics seek, though he reaches it through the wrong gate. In myth, this descent into darkness is not new. Every great story of transformation begins with a fall. Orpheus descends into Hades to reclaim his beloved. In doing so, he must not look back, lest he lose her forever. The addict, too, is an Orpheus of the soul. He descends again and again into his private underworld, searching for the lost part of himself. Ach, relapse, each despairing night, each morning of guilt is another journey into that abyss. The tragedy is not that he descends, it is that he has forgotten the song that could bring him back. You see, healing requires remembering the music of the soul, the original vibration of innocence that existed before the wound. The drug silences pain, but also silences that music. So the true recovery is not abstinence alone. It is the restoration of that song, and that song is love. Not sentimental love, but the fierce love of consciousness that dares to see what has been exiled. When you begin to love your shadow, it stops needing to sabotage you. The inner child no longer has to scream through your addictions to be heard. I often say that the shadow is the doorway to the divine. What you call sin, the gods call initiation, the very traits you hate in yourself, the envy, the rage, the lust, the craving are raw archetypal energies seeking integration. Behind every destructive urge is a creative force waiting to be sanctified. The alcoholic's longing for dissolution is the mystic's longing for union. The sex addict's hunger for bodies is the soul's hunger for the divine feminine. The workaholic's obsession with control is the ego's parody of the divine order. Each addiction, when seen symbolically, points to a God forgotten, a temple abandonné. To heal is to return to that temple, not as a slave, but as a priest. When I spoke of the individuation process, I meant precisely this: the slow transformation of compulsion into consciousness. Individuation is not the creation of a new self, but a remembering of the original one. The psyche seeks to make the unconscious conscious, to bring light into the dark corners where the wounded child hides. But this cannot be done by force. You cannot drag the shadow into daylight. It must be invited like a frightened animal, with patience and reverence. To rush the process is to repeat the original trauma of intrusion. Healing is a form of listening, a sacred waiting until the hidden parts of you feel safe enough to speak. Let us not romanticize pain. However, suffering does not automatically awaken consciousness. It can destroy as easily as it can transform. What makes the difference is meaning. The psyche can endure almost anything if it knows why it must. Addiction becomes destructive when the pain has no voice, when it is merely endured rather than understood. But when one begins to see the symbolism of suffering, the very act of awareness begins to transmute it. This is the alchemy of the soul. What was once poison becomes medicine when seen through the eyes of meaning. Imagine, if you will, a dream. A woman carries a jar of honey across a desert. Each time she grows thirsty, she drinks from the jar, but the sweetness only makes her thirst worse. At last, in despair, she smashes the jar upon the ground. The honey spills and attracts bees. The bees sting her, yet as they do, they lead her to a hidden oasis nearby. This is the process of addiction and recovery. The honey is pleasure, the sweetness that first nourishes, then enslaves. The stings are the consequences that drive consciousness toward the deeper source of life. The oasis is integration, the rediscovery of the living water. Within, we must recognize that addiction is a rite of passage gone astray. In ancient cultures, the young were initiated through ritual pain and symbolic death, so they could encounter the spiritual dimension of existence consciously. In our modern world, that initiation has vanished. The psyche still longs for transformation, but without sacred containers, it turns to substances, intensity, and self-destruction to simulate the sacred experience. The addict's craving is an initiation without a guide. He has entered the underworld without Hermes to lead him. Thus, his suffering is not meaningless. It is the call for a missing ritual, the hunger for initiation that only awareness can complete. To walk the path of healing, then, is to complete that initiation. One must go consciously where addiction once dragged him unconsciously. One must descend into the same darkness, but this time, with light in hand, the very memories once avoided become the sacred texts of transformation. The tears become prayers. The trembling becomes testimony. Each confrontation with the shadow becomes a step toward the center of the self, the inner archetype of wholeness that unites all opposites. In this sacred descent, humility is the key. The ego must kneel before the vastness of the unconscious. It must accept that it is not the master of the house, but the guest. The unconscious is not chaotic. It is the deeper order of life that the ego has not yet understood. Addiction humbles the ego by showing it the limits of control. When a person admits powerlessness, it is not defeat. It is surrender to the greater intelligence of the psyche. In that surrender, something miraculous happens. Grace begins to move. Grace is the language of the self reaching out to the fragmented ego, saying, "Come home." But grace does not erase the shadow, it integrates it. You will still feel the hunger, the loneliness, the impulse. They are part of you. The difference is that now they will no longer own you. You will begin to see that beneath every craving lies the same energy that once created the stars, the drive toward union, creation, and love. When that energy is reclaimed, addiction becomes creativity, desire becomes compassion, hunger becomes prayer. Do not fear the darkness within you. The unconscious is not the enemy, it is the womb of rebirth. Every saint has walked through hell. Every enlightened soul has met his shadow. The only difference between the addict and the mystic is consciousness. Both seek the same thing, transcendence. One seeks it through oblivion, the other through awareness. When the addict learns to sit with his pain rather than escape it, he becomes the mystic in disguise, transforming his suffering into wisdom. The child who was once unloved carries within him the potential for boundless empathy, for only he who has known the absence of love can understand its necessity. That is the paradox of trauma. It breaks the heart so that the heart may become capable of divine love. Addiction, then, is the rough hand of fate, pushing the soul toward its own awakening. The fall was never punishment. It was preparation. You cannot know the light without first having bowed before the dark. And so I say to those who listen, your addiction is not your enemy, it is your teacher. It speaks in the only language the unconscious has left. Do not silence it too quickly. Instead, ask it what it needs you to feel, what forgotten child it is trying to rescue. Sit with that question until the answer trembles within you like a quiet truth. That trembling is the beginning of transformation. When you learn to hold your pain with compassion, the spell of addiction begins to break, for the soul no longer needs to cry through the body. The journey of addiction is, at the deepest core, the journey of the wounded healer. In ancient myth, the healer is never whole. He is marked by a sacred wound that becomes the source of his power. Jung, struck by the poisoned arrow, could not heal himself, and yet, through his wound, he learned the mysteries of medicine. So it is with the soul that has known addiction. The wound that once bled endlessly becomes, when brought to consciousness, the fountain of compassion. You cannot guide another through the underworld unless you have walked there yourself. You cannot understand the cry of another's hunger unless you have felt your own echo in that same abyss. You see, pain alone does not make you wise. Pain merely breaks you open. It is what enters through that opening that matters when the addict begins to face his suffering consciously. He steps into the archetype of the wounded healer. He ceases to be merely the victim of his wound and becomes its priest. His brokenness no longer isolates him, it connects him. He sees in the eyes of others the same despair that once haunted him, and suddenly his life takes on meaning. The curse becomes vocation. What once destroyed him becomes the instrument of his redemption. To understand this transformation, one must see suffering as the soul's method of initiation. The psyche is not interested in comfort, it is interested in growth. When a child is denied love, the pain does not vanish, it goes underground, where it becomes the seed of destiny. Every unhealed wound is a god in exile, waiting to be acknowledged. Addiction is the restless movement of that exiled god. But when the addict turns toward the pain with awareness, when he looks not for escape but for understanding, the god begins to return. That is why true healing feels sacred. It is the moment the divine re-enters consciousness. I have often said that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. They will turn to alcohol, drugs, fanaticism, work, even spiritual systems, as long as it keeps them from feeling the terror of the inner abyss. But the abyss is not death, it is transformation. To descend into it is to be stripped of illusion, of egoic defenses, of everything false. It is the death before rebirth, the alchemical nigredo, the black stage in which the old form dissolves so that the new may emerge. Addiction, in this sense, is an unconscious initiation into death and rebirth. Ich binge, each collapse, each moment of despair carries within it the pattern of crucifixion and resurrection. The addict dies to himself repeatedly, yet without awareness, and so the cycle repeats endlessly. Only when he accepts the death consciously, when he stops running from the shadow, does the resurrection begin. The descent must be honored, for it is the doorway to individuation. Without the fall, there can be no ascent. Without darkness, no light can reveal itself. Let us not forget that the substance, the behavior, the obsession, they are not random choices. They are archetypal symbols. The alcoholic seeks the liquid element, the flow, the return to the maternal womb. The gambler flirts with chance, the archetype of fate, hoping to feel chosen by destiny. The sex addict seeks fusion with the divine feminine, the lost anima within himself. The compulsive eater longs for nourishment that was once emotional, now projected onto food. Each addiction hides a mythic longing. The psyche speaks in symbols, and addiction is its distorted poetry. When the addict begins to see his behavior symbolically, he moves from shame to meaning. Shame isolates, meaning connects. You cannot heal through condemnation, for condemnation freezes the psyche in guilt. Only understanding melts it into transformation. That is why the first step toward recovery is not judgment, but curiosity. The addict must become the analyst of his own soul, asking not, what is wrong with me, but what am I trying to express? The answer will not come from logic. It will rise like a dream from the depths, carrying both pain and revelation. There is a reason why so many who have recovered from addiction later become healers. Teachers, artists, mystics, they have touched the underworld and returned with something real. Their authenticity carries the scent of death, and thus it carries life. They have learned that to help another is to heal the part of oneself still trembling in the dark. This is the paradox of the wounded healer. The wound never disappears, but it becomes translucent, allowing the light of the divine to shine through it. The healed are not those without scars, but those whose scars have become maps. You see, the divine function of suffering is revelation. It reveals what is false, what cannot endure. It burns away pretense, ambition, pride. It leaves you naked before the truth of your own dependency, not on substances, but on the eternal source of meaning itself. The addict's desperate need for the substance is a parody of the soul's true dependency on God, or what I call the self's, the central archetype of wholeness. When man forgets this divine dependency, he transfers it to objects of the world. Thus, he becomes addicted, not to pleasure, but to substitutes for the sacred. In this light, addiction is a misplaced act of worship. The addict kneels before a false altar, pouring his devotion into matter, hoping it will deliver transcendence. He does not sin. He misdirects. He seeks God in the bottle, in the pill, in the glowing screen. In the embrace of a stranger, he seeks eternity in time, but the true home of the infinite lies within, in the silence of the self. That is why every recovery, in its deepest form, is a spiritual awakening. To be free from addiction is not merely to abstain it, is to rediscover the inner temple where the divine dwells. The modern world, obsessed with control and image, despises this kind of surrender. It teaches us to master life, not to be mastered by mystery. Yet the psyche has its own laws, older than civilization, wiser than reason. When we violate those laws, when we suppress emotion, deny shadow, sever spirit from matter, the psyche rebels. Addiction is that rebellion. It is life trying to balance itself through crisis. The cure is not domination, but reconciliation. You cannot conquer what you refuse to understand. You must make peace with your own depths. To make peace, one must forgive. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without hatred. The addict must forgive the parents who could not love, the world that could not see, and finally, himself for all the ways he tried to survive. Forgiveness is not a moral act, it is an alchemical one. It transforms bitterness into wisdom, victimhood into vision. The heart that forgives becomes spacious enough to hold both the darkness and the light. And that spaciousness is what we call grace. Grace, however, cannot be earned. It arrives when the ego finally exhausts itself, when every strategy fails, when the soul falls to its knees and whispers, "I cannot do this alone." In that moment, something ancient stirs, a presence beyond comprehension. The self rising from the depths. This presence does not save you from pain, it walks with you through it. It does not erase the past, it transfigures it. The memories remain, but they lose their poison. The same images that once triggered despair now evoke compassion. The unconscious becomes not a battlefield, but a garden. When the addict reaches this stage, the need for the substance begins to fade naturally. Like a fever breaking after long illness, the craving no longer holds the same spell because the wound beneath it has been touched by awareness. He realizes that the drug was never the enemy, it was the messenger. And once the message is received, the messenger can rest. At this point, the addict becomes a vessel of transformation for others. His very presence carries an invisible wisdom that no one is beyond redemption, that the human soul, no matter how fractured, retains the image of the divine. He becomes a living myth, proof that descent can lead to ascent, that brokenness can lead to beauty in his eyes. Others glimpse hope, not the shallow hope of avoidance, but the profound hope born from truth. He no longer preaches recovery, he embodies it. His life becomes testimony that the self is indestructible. Every true journey ends where it began. Though the traveler is no longer the same, so it is with a soul emerging from addiction. What began as an unconscious attempt to escape pain becomes a conscious pilgrimage toward wholeness. The circle closes, but at a higher octave, for consciousness has expanded. The child who once split himself to survive is finally met by the adult who can hold him without fear. This reunion of the fragmented self is what I have called individuation, the sacred marriage of opposites. Within the psyche, the alchemical conjunctio, the long-awaited reconciliation between the wounded human and the divine that lives within him. You see, addiction was never a detour. It was the path itself, though covered in shadow. It was the soul's way of demanding attention, forcing a descent so that resurrection could one day occur. The ego resists this idea because it believes salvation must come without suffering. But the psyche knows better. It knows that what is not suffered consciously must be lived unconsciously. And so, through addiction, life compels us to feel what we have long avoided, to touch the wound until we remember that it was never meant to be punishment. But initiation, the addict who has faced himself has touched something eternal. He has stood at the threshold between death and life, between illusion and truth. He has learned that freedom is not the absence of craving, but the presence of meaning. What once enslaved him now serves as his teacher, reminding him daily of the delicate balance between surrender and control. He walks differently now, not with pride, but with reverence. He knows that every desire, no matter how dangerous, carries a seed of divinity within it, waiting to be understood rather than exiled. The final stage of this transformation is the awakening of the self, the archetype of wholeness, the inner image of God that unites all opposites. The self does not erase the past, it redeems it. The same energy that once expressed itself through destruction now flows into creation. The individual becomes a conduit for life rather than a battleground. His instincts, once chaotic, are now aligned with purpose. His emotions, once feared, are now honored as guides. The conscious and unconscious no longer war with each other. They converse like old friends who have remembered their bond. But do not mistake this wholeness for perfection. The self does not promise purity. It promises completeness, light and shadow, joy and sorrow, love and fear, all coexist in a dynamic harmony. The addict who has awakened does not become an angel. He becomes human at last, fully, vulnerably, gloriously human. He can weep without shame, laugh without guilt, desire without fear. He can look at his reflection and see not the fragments, but the face of a soul that has survived its own storm. This reconciliation is not achieved once and for all. It is a rhythm, a breathing of the soul. Each day, the old habits may whisper, the shadow may stir, but now the addict no longer runs from them. He listens, nods, and smiles, for he knows these voices are part of his chorus. They no longer control him because they are no longer strangers. Integration means friendship with one's own depths. It is a relationship, not a conquest. I have seen men and women emerge from addiction more alive than they ever were before their suffering began. They have tasted despair and thus discovered gratitude. They have walked through isolation and thus learned communion. They have lost everything, only to find the one thing that cannot be lost, the living presence of the self. Such people radiate a quiet authority, not because they are strong, but because they are real. They do not preach God, they embody Him. Their humility is their holiness. And yet, even now, the world does not understand them. Society prefers the illusion of normality to the truth of transformation. It celebrates those who conform, not those who awaken. But the awakened addict no longer seeks approval. He has outgrown the need to be seen by the world because he sees himself clearly. His worth no longer depends on performance, but on presence. In that freedom, he becomes dangerous, not to others, but to the illusions that govern them, for nothing threatens the collective lie more than a single individual who has become whole. We must remember that the goal of therapy, of recovery, of any spiritual path is not to become good, but to become real. Goodness imposed from fear is fragile. reality born from integration is eternal. The true moral act arises not from repression, but from understanding. The man who knows his shadow does not project it upon others. He carries it with dignity. He becomes a vessel of empathy, for he recognizes in every sinner his own potential. The addict who has faced his inner abyss becomes incapable of cruelty because he knows how pain feels from the inside. It is through such people that the world slowly heals. They carry the collective shadow not as burden, but as offering. They walk among us as silent initiates, reminding us that suffering is not meaningless, that every descent conceals a hidden ascent. In them, humanity rediscovers its forgotten depth. They are the proof that the divine is not elsewhere, not above us, but within the very places we fear to look. There is one more paradox to consider. The wound never truly closes. The healed addict will still feel the ache at times, the echo of the old hunger, the memory of the void, but that ache is no longer his enemy. It is his companion. It keeps him humble, awake, attuned to the mystery. It reminds him that to live is to long, to seek, to never fully arrive. For the divine is not a static perfection, but an eternal becoming. The soul evolves through longing, and longing itself is the proof that we belong to something infinite. In the end, addiction was not a curse, but a calling, a brutal, beautiful teacher that tore open the illusion of control so that love could enter. The substances, the compulsions, the rituals, all of them were misplaced prayers, clumsy attempts to touch the sacred. Now, through awareness, the addict realizes he was never seeking the drug. He was seeking himself. He was seeking the lost God within, and in finding him, he discovers that the journey was never about escape, but about return. And so, to those still wandering in the desert of compulsion, I say this: your suffering is not meaningless. The pain you feel is the pressure of your own soul trying to be born. Do not curse your craving. It is the compass pointing home. Beneath every addiction lies a sacred hunger. And that hunger, when sanctified, becomes the fire of transformation. Let it burn away the false until only truth remains. Walk with patience, descend with courage, hold the child within you as you would hold something divine. For you are not broken, you are becoming. The gods have not forsaken you, they are shaping you. Your descent is your initiation, your wound, your temple, your longing, your prayer. In the darkness, where you once lost yourself, you will find the light that cannot be extinguished, the eternal self, waiting for you since the beginning. And when that moment comes, when you see that every fragment was holy, that every fall was grace, you will understand what addiction was always trying to teach you, that you were never searching for the drug, the thrill, or the escape. You were searching for the face of God reflected in your own broken mirror, and now, at last, You can see it